Right. Well, welcome everybody. Good to see you all here tonight. As Nicky was just saying, this is more of a conversation than a presentation, which is becoming the style within ASP. So I'm not sure I've met Roger before, but he's still connecting. But everyone else I know quite well. But what I wanted to do briefly was just to give a short introduction to this. We're joined tonight, obviously, by Nicky, Saunter and Andrew Sims. Nicky is an ASP member, but both Nicky and Andrew are, I think you're both co-founders of the Rapid Transition Alliance. Which,
I'm not a founder, but Andrew is.
Okay, right. Hi, Roger. Roger, we're recording, if that's okay. Cool. Nicky and I have been kicking this around for a little while now. One of the ideas within ASP is to actually extend our relationships from being person to person, i.e. our practitioner membership, to also being organization to organization. And Mark's climate crisis organization is also an organization we're looking at that resonates more with what we do and complements. So no competition, and there's no question of coordinating. It's just a question of recognizing these organizations exist and seeing how we can sort of nurture each other. So Mark's is very much an artists-based network. And the thing that drew me to Rapid Transition Alliance is the fact that they actually do what we don't do, in a sense. ASP is very much, if you like, a community for learning and building relationships and learning together that way. Whereas RTA is partly that, but also actually gets down to some stuff called action and impact and stuff, actually suggests things that people could actually do in reality to help change the situation, which I love, because that's one thing I felt that we haven't really addressed a lot in ASP. And then when Nicky suggested the subject for tonight was evidence-based trust. Yeah. Hope. That really sunk into me, because I spent the first sort of 20, 30 years of my life studying physics, before I went to school, when I went to school, degree course. And so that was all very much to do with the headspace of evidence. And when I had the sort of my sort of epiphany, I sort of cast that aside for a while and started to explore this other area, that the heart space. And it was a bit like a pendulum swinging completely the opposite direction. And the challenge for me over the last sort of 5 or 6 years is how to bring the balance back between the head and the heart. I'm convinced now more than anything that we make our most important decisions with our heart and then justify them or work out the actions with our head. So we use evidence, we use data, etc. And I realized that evidence-based hope anchors three things for me, because evidence-based hope. I've moved from hoping people will sort the world out to trusting that we can. And for me, that was a big shift. So hope for me was a way of almost abdicating my own responsibility and impact. So I've moved over to trust. So this statement, or these three words, were quite challenging for me. And then I realized over the weekend that the evidence is the headspace conversation and dialogue, and hope is the heart-based, and based in the middle is like a foundation. So I thought these three words beautifully give us this foundation to unify the heart and the head. That's what it means for me. I don't know what it'll mean for you. I'm not sure whether Andrew ever thought of that, or Nicky did, or whether that's so blatantly obvious that's why they chose it. So I'd love to explore that side sometime today if we get the chance. So, in ASPs, our three words are connect, challenge, and support. And I think that I love these triplets. They seem to work very well in communicating. So I'm going to be quiet now. I'm just going to hand over to Nicky and Andrew. They're going to talk for maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, and then let's just turn it into a quite organic conversation. Feel free to raise your hand for questions or comments as you see fit. Okay, Nicky, over to you and Andrew.
Great, thanks very much, Gwyn. I'm going to start. So my name is Nicky Saunter, and I work, among other things, for the Rapid Transition Alliance, and have done for the past few years, alongside one of its founders, Andrew Sims. Andrew and I also have known each other for a very long time, since our teens, by complete coincidence, and have ended up working together in our 50s, which is really very nice indeed. So we can be horribly honest with each other. And it's one of the reasons why we thought it'd be nice to have this as much
she
more.
She is as well, horribly honest. I should just point that out.
Why we wanted to make this much more of an informal conversation as well. So I'm going to talk just a bit about the Alliance from my point of view. And we could talk about our feelings about hope, and share some stories with you, and then open up the discussion. That's the sort of rough plan. So the premise of the Alliance is it's a network of international organisations that are engaged in practical work, in research, in campaigning, and all geared towards tackling the climate and ecological crisis. To do this, we use what we describe as evidence-based hope. And yes, that is, Andrew coined that entirely. Very nice phrase. Which for us means telling stories about positive change that has happened in the past that could help us in the future. So looking for inspirational examples of how we might move together at the scale and speed necessary for building a sustainable future together, and living within planetary boundaries. And I thought it might be quite nice. I've picked up a few examples on our website, which is rapidtransition.org. If you look on the website, you'll see it's very story-based. So we collect information or particular examples around the world where we think a transition has happened in a time and at a scale, or something that could be scalable, and we describe that and reflect on it, and it is very practical in its application. And like Gwyn, I rather like that, because it gives, for me personally, I think at the time when I started working for the Alliance, it gave me some feeling that something was happening, and something could happen, and something might happen even more in the future. So it probably personally for me fed into a need for some actual real hope, rather than what Gwyn was describing, which is a sort of another kind of hope, isn't it? That almost like a more hope as a kind of desperation, rather than hope as an active practical thing. And so I've asked Andrew also if he can think of a couple of examples of stories that are on our website and that you can see in much more detail. And together we'll discuss some of those stories, and then come to you for some questions and reflections on whatever you'd like to reflect. So what does he think about it now? I would be interested to know, what do you think and feel about it now?
Thank you, Nicky. That's a really good question, and it kind of does cast my mind back. And it's nice being asked to reflect on things, because quite often you get so caught up in the swirl of things that you don't often get the chance to reflect. And I think it's very much an example. Just before we came on, Gwyn and Nicky and I were talking about when we do work, that the tension between things which are funded and things which are sort of just done in whatever way you can marshal the personal resources to do. And I think one of the things, even though our life histories have come at things from slightly different angles, Nicky and I both, I think, have operated on a sort of an entrepreneurial basis, and that we have willed things into existence. In Nicky's case, it's some sort of businesses and enterprises and other campaigns, and mine has mostly been in the kind of the policy and the campaigning area. And if I think back over the last couple of decades, a couple of things which led to the Rapid Transition Alliance were things that we were doing in the late 90s and in the 2000s, when we were working on the climate crisis. And I was at the New Economics Foundation as its policy director for quite a long time. And a couple of the things that I did there was we came up with the Green New Deal back in 2008, which was our positive response at the time of the financial crisis. Because at the time of the financial crisis, there was also the energy price crisis, and there were a wave of extreme weather events happening around the world that were hitting food supplies, etc. So the Green New Deal was this sort of comprehensive response that both dealt with some of the economics of it and the banking failure, and was supposed to lay the foundations for investing in low carbon transition. But at the same time as that, we also ran another thing for a while, which was a bit of a kind of climate countdown clock, using the IPCC's definition of risk to how long it would be before it was no longer likely, and likely was one of their sort of definitions of risk, that we would stay below 2 degrees. And that gave us a time span from 2008 onwards of only about kind of 8 years or so. And at the same time, we were doing other kind of policy initiatives, like came up with a thing called Earth Overshoot Day, which shows the day in the year when, in effect, we start living beyond the biosphere's ability to regenerate and absorb the waste that we produce. And these are all kind of throwing up really big questions about how powerless was the state that we were in, and whether or not we would even have the ability, with the best will in the world, to turn things around. So it was sort of becoming extremely obvious, or two things were becoming really obvious to me. One was that it wasn't just that it was important for us to do the right things, we had to do them within an environmental time frame that was kind of non-negotiable. So, and the other thing was looking around at the other campaigning and policy and advocacy work that was going on in the environmental movement. I didn't see many people who were making proposals that looked like they stood to remotely match the speed and scale of action that was necessary. And I thought, I talked to a lot of people at the time, and you had the typical conversation. Rapid Transition Alliance was to test that idea. It's say, have we ever been in situations where we've achieved change like that? So before we created the Rapid Transition Alliance, we kind of cobbled together sort of friends and favors, and went around the country and held a number of seminars looking at different areas of activity, whether it was kind of finance, or whether it was kind of cities or transport or energy, and just to kind of test the idea, looking for historical precedents when change happened really quickly, and that could potentially be learnt from and scaled out and rolled out at a bigger scale. So we did that, and then through a chance encounter with a potential funder, after doing this for about 18 months and publishing a pamphlet, we published a pamphlet called How Did We Do That?, which was a collection of the examples which I'd sort of culled together from the various seminars that we'd organized, and all done on not even a shoestring, on an invisible shoestring, on no money whatsoever. And I found myself on one of those occasions on a Saturday morning when you've agreed to go and speak at a thing, and then you wake up on Saturday morning and you kind of kick yourself and think, why did I agree to do that? And I dragged myself along and to sit in this room, and it was actually, it was kind of, at that time, it would have appeared to be a more sort of oblique way of talking about the issues. Today, storytelling seems to have kind of gathered favor more and has sort of become much more of a thing. But it was to talk about the role of storytelling in communicating the climate crisis. And I sort of did my piece, and just as a kind of another sort of love project that we willed into existence as a spin-off that Nicky has also been involved in from the outset, we'd been publishing collections of modern folk tales for troubling times. The first one was called There Was a Knock at the Door. The second volume was called Knock Twice, and unsurprisingly, the third volume was called Knock 3 Times. The fourth volume was called something very different, though. So we'd been doing this thing, and that came out of the interest in the way in which a lot of the classic folk and fairy tales that we live with today have emerged in times of extremity and crisis, and when humanity has had its kind of back to the wall. And I found that interesting, and I thought there was something in that. Anyway, long story short, there happened to be somebody zooming in on an iPad, listening in on what was going on, who happened to be with a big Scandinavian foundation, who happened to find it interesting, who happened to then say, what you're talking about in terms of kind of rapid change is interesting. Can we have a conversation? And that led to the Rapid Transition Alliance. And it was very much about thinking that what the movement needed was clear, figurative examples that demonstrate where we have already shown our ability to achieve rapid change. And of course, no one occasion is a perfect proxy for another time. And what I thought we would be able to do potentially over time is build up the lessons and insights from multiple different circumstances, multiple different geographies, different times, and that with this we would both shift the conversation to one of possibility rather than obstacle, and actually get some understanding of what are the conditions under which rapid, socially just change becomes more possible, not guaranteed, but at least more possible. And I don't know whether now's the moment to kind of mention a couple of the examples that that sort of kind of worked for me. But one of the ones that stuck with me when we did our first round of seminars, because I was kind of acutely aware of it at the time, as one of my favorite ones. You think back to 2010, when an unpronounceable volcano in Iceland erupted. And because of the particular nature of the fine silt that came because of its particular geographical, topographical position, it injected this dust into the slipstream, the airstream, which is lethal to modern jet engines. And as a consequence, overnight, the whole of the sort of European airline industry came to a standstill. You know, this thing which everybody had come utterly to take for granted, one of the arteries of the modern global economy. And it was just switched off overnight. And you think, oh my God, the sky is going to fall on our heads. But with amazing speed and rapidity, where supply lines were cut for shops that require daily restocking and things like, you know, fresh salads and stuff like that, the major supermarkets were able to switch suppliers. They localized suppliers. Politicians who were not able to be present in their parliaments, like Jens Stoltenberg, Norway's prime minister, was stuck at the UN. He governed from his iPad from the UN building. People found other ways of getting around, other transport modes put on surplus capacity. People car shared, sofa surfed, and all the rest of it. And what it told me was we've got this latent ability for change and adaptation, which when tested can be astonishing, but we weren't tapping into it. And the other example I thought, which is kind of completely different, but equally profound, I think, in terms of its implication at the time of the financial crisis, when just a year before the financial crisis started kicking off, Gordon Brown was boasting about the light touch regulation of the City of London. You know, a year later, all shit kicks off. And again, almost overnight, something that I think we've been conditioned to think was impossible happened, in that a huge swathe of our financial infrastructure, our high street commercial banks, were effectively nationalized. And we discovered overnight that there is this thing which has more latterly been denied, a magic money tree, only they called it quantitative easing. That just made the point that where resources are needed in order to meet what is has been decided by political consensus is a genuine threat that requires a response, resources can be found. And the third example, which kind of travels with me very much, and there's kind of each of these examples has kind of a lot more depth to it, is what we've just come out of living through over the last few years during the pandemic. And the pandemic, actually, if you go on the rapidtransition.org, we've got a whole bevy of materials about lessons and things to be learned from the pandemic, because even though it's been an incredibly traumatic experience for a lot of people, it's also demonstrated the fact that we can change everything from how we see essential workers in the economy, to where and how we work, to the layout and organization of our town centres, such that you can, again, virtually overnight, reorganize it to favour pedestrians and cyclists, and to give space back to local business and take it back from cars, through to rediscovering some of our both creative and other capacities, whether it's in terms of cooking, making, mending, repairing things, changing our relationship to stuff, changing our relationship to work, changing our urban environments, and again finding resources overnight to deal with a great need. And so once you start looking throughout history and all around the world and right up to the present moment, there are examples where we show what we're kind of capable of. As yet, that sense of urgency and that focus and application has not been applied to a rapid and socially just transition of fossil fuels. But I think holding those examples in view both reduces the excuse, makes the alternative more plausible and believable, opens up space in which we can have that conversation, reminds us of what we can do, and brings the possibility of that change that much closer. And that really, for me, has been what the Rapid Transition Alliance is kind of all about. It's been as much kind of, I suppose, wanting to prove to myself, to see for myself, whether the sorts of things that I would like to believe do have an evidence base, whether my own sense of where I'm not quite sure where it comes from, and I know it does annoy a lot of people, but I do feel pathologically hopeful. I mean, yeah, I'm intellectually pessimistic, but I'm pathologically hopeful. It's that there's an old line from Antonio Gramsci which talks about optimism of the will and pessimism of the mind, and I think the Rapid Transition Alliance is a kind of a manifestation of that. And perhaps it's also a little bit of a manifestation of a book I once wrote called Cancel the Apocalypse. So something about acknowledging the scale of the threat, but acknowledging a sort of an intent to stop it from happening. And I'll shut up.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm just going to add on to that three examples, because they're quite different examples. And I wanted to echo what Andrew said about the work on the pandemic that we did, because it was really interesting. Just through circumstances, I was one of those people who was freelance, but not for long enough to be treated as to get furlough, etc. So I just carried on working. I was very lucky that I was able to carry on just working. And because we'd always worked on a shoestring trying to get people to do interviews online because it was too expensive to travel all over the place. Basically, work moved towards us rather than the other way around. So my daily work became more easier for me during the pandemic, even as the environment around me changed. It was a very interesting place to sit, especially as my work then became writing and thinking about that learning. And I also wanted to bring up the fact of nature. So I'm lucky enough to live in a very rural place in Somerset. And I saw the lane in front of my office where normally I see about 2 people and a hedgehog going past. Actually, there are no hedgehogs, but sometimes there's some animals go past. And during lockdown, I saw little troops of families going past, from 10 o'clock in the morning all day, including teenagers who are never seen in the countryside. It's like a rare beast. And how lovely that was indeed, saying, like, waving to people through the window, and how as soon as lockdown ended, it literally stopped, like a tap turning off. So I think that some of the pandemic learning for me was particularly about use of space, awareness of consumption, and particularly an appreciation, a renewed, perhaps a totally new awareness for many people of the importance of nature in our lives. And one of the examples I picked is sort of linked to that. I just love the example. You may know it, but it's the story of the Wanganui River in New Zealand being given legal rights similar to that of a person, and a sort of a guardianship set up in order to uphold those rights in law. And there was something fantastic about this happening, particularly in New Zealand, because the name of the river is also the name of the people, the native peoples living in that area. And those people, of course, had 200 years of struggle to get recognition themselves even. And in doing this recognition for the river, it seemed like a marvelous piece of seemed very sensible. It also seemed a very generous and very beautiful thing to do. And also to bring an understanding in such a concrete way to those of us who do not live in a culture where a river would normally be treated as a living being with rights of its own. And that concept has been taken up by other people around the world. And I think there's a couple of campaigns in the UK at the moment. I seem to think the Medway is a river at the moment that's campaigning to people are campaigning to have the river recognised as a living, breathing piece of life with its own rights. So I think that example is brilliant. You can find a lot more detail in the stories on the website. The other one of the ones I like particularly is quite sort of prosaic, but I like it because it's in the UK here and it's quite mundane and it's within my own lifetime. And I found it very interesting. And it was the fact that between 1968, I have to read dates because I'm very bad at remembering numbers. Between 1968 and 1976, 14 million homes in the UK were switched from town gas to natural gas. And this was done it's supposed to be a 10-year program. They actually did it in closer to between 8 and 9 years. So it was an organised campaign with a program of work to switch people's stoves. They literally had conversion kits. Some of them, I don't know how many of them you could do yourself. Mostly it was somebody going to your local showroom on your high street, of which there were many in those days, and asking for what you would need in order to convert, and then an engineer would come and convert the gas jets literally on your stove. And I think at the time it was also used as a way of trying to get people to upgrade their stoves and other equipment. But the amazing thing was it was done in a very low-key kind of way through probably public information campaigns, through having a high street presence, and just through very good planning, old-fashioned planning, which makes you think, if we get together and decide to do something and then plan it properly and put resources into it, we can do these things. So I thought it was a really interesting example of how if we were to do the same thing, and obviously if we'd done it earlier, it would be great. If we were to do the same thing with different types of green energy, we would be a long way, we'd be moving in the right direction much more quickly. And that's actually just a very basic example from here. And the last one I like is a story we've done recently, actually, about a hospital, Tambacounda Hospital in Senegal, which I know something about. Building, sustainable building. I've always been very interested in that. And this was a remarkable design, really, using design rather than using high tech. And quite often that design is something that already exists in a particular environment. People locally have already learned how to deal with a certain problem, and sometimes we just don't ask them in the right way or don't ask them at all. And this hospital in Senegal has been designed without air conditioning. It's built very recently in a place where temperatures regularly top 40 degrees. 50,000 bricks, all made on site, double-skinned roof, using the orientation of the building to reduce the sun's impact, and using the traditional means of building with bricks with lots of holes in to encourage airflow through the building. And they basically have, it's a working space with the proper temperatures for running, for doing operations and keeping people in a comfortable environment. And I just thought that was beautiful. It's useful because it's actually a thing. You can say to people, here's a thing, look at it, go and look at how they've done it and how well it was done with lots of collaboration with people working in the building as well. And I just think that as a whole process, as well as a finished building, is a lovely idea. Andrew, I don't know whether you've got any further reflections on that, particularly on hope. I know you've spoken quite a bit about hope already, but I don't know whether you have anything else you'd like to finish off with. Otherwise, I'd like to say I found doing this work for me has been in some ways therapeutic too, finding and writing about people who've made amazing changes. Sometimes they're changes to the built environment, and sometimes they're changes to ways of thinking, as with the river example. And I personally found that very useful for myself, and also useful sometimes in that awful space where everyone is just dooming and glooming or poo-pooing green things, particularly a few years ago, when poo-pooing the idea that you could change to a sustainable world and we would be able to do that. There was a lot of it's a nice bit of pushback against the tech will answer all argument, I find. Any other thoughts, Andrew?
I suppose the other thoughts are simply that I think as and this is not saying anything kind of necessarily new, but I think what it's done for me also is try to shift. The conversation I have most commonly with my kind of campaigning colleagues is that it's very two things are sort of typical tropes I find in conversation and in campaigning. One is there's a tendency kind of to drift off into kind of tech speak and use numbers and figures and get a little bit abstract. And the other is to be a little bit downbeat and also to dismiss the possibility of positive change. So either kind of go down a techno-fix route, or to go down a slightly despairing route. And I kind of take Raymond Williams' line on hope, that to be, truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. And I think by talking in examples, by giving stories, by showing real world experiences, it lifts the whole thing out of that. And I think more broadly in our campaign, the thing about talking in examples, talking in practicalities, I get I suppose if we're talking about feelings, there's two things, I suppose. One, I could say that given how relatively easy it's been for us to kind of find and pattern all these examples, it leaves me feeling more bewildered that people that governments would actively, I mean, and I do understand the kind of the politics and the economics of it, but would actively choose such bad options to go down the wrong route in so many circumstances. So there's a little bit of bewilderment sort of in there, and just, I suppose, the frustration of thinking, which again is not a new insight, that the potential to make things better, to do things that can ward off a climate and ecological crisis, and in the process also potentially immensely enhance our well-being, change our relationship to our work, to our neighborhoods, to our communities, to our environment in a really positive way. I'm kind of left with this sort of the frustration of feeling that at our fingertips is this opportunity, a world to win, and the understanding and the insight and the examples all around us that we can kind of learn from. And it was the tenacity of a political establishment that seems determined at every turn to go 180 degrees in the wrong direction and do the wrong thing. So I suppose a kind of through this work, I'm left feeling slightly poised at this peculiar sort of point of sensing possibility, experiencing bewilderment, and wanting to get on with it.
Yeah, thank you. That's lovely. I think it'd be really nice now, because I'm conscious we've only got half an hour or so left, to just open it up if Gwyn's happy to do that. Gwyn, are you happy to moderate, and just if people would like to if have any questions, and maybe when you ask your question or make your contribution, if you want to reflect on it, if you just say who you are and a bit about what you do, it's quite useful. Just where you come from, it's useful for us.
Go ahead, Mark. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Mark Goldthorpe. I run a network and a website called Climate Cultures, which is principally for artists and creative researchers. And our tagline is creative conversations for the Anthropocene. And I wanted to pick up on this really interesting distinction, I think, between hope and optimism, because I've some time ago, like, I had my own sort of turning point, if you like, perhaps analogous to Gwyn's in some ways, having worked on over 25-30 years, worked with businesses on finding solutions to waste and pollution and energy issues, and working with policymakers on developing policy for adapting to the inevitable impacts of climate change, as well as trying to reduce those avoidable impacts. I became somewhat disillusioned with the lack of progress, as of course we all are, and sort of evidence against my previous optimism that some of these easy, seemingly obvious solutions should be easy once people understood both the urgency of the problem and indeed the fact that there are ways to approach and tackle those problems, and yet we don't seem to be doing that. So my own movement was then more towards the arts, and to what I could see as a crisis or a failure of imagination underlying the actual climate and ecological crisis, that we somehow are incapable as a species, and as certainly as policymakers, decision makers, of actually grasping what the situation is and then acting in an appropriate way. And I just came to see that smaller approaches to these big issues, through the work of artists, through the work of writers and poets and sculptors and filmmakers and whoever it might be, who can just engage the imagination, might be the ways to start to tilt that lack of grasp, but not to expect that to be rapid, I should say. But in that process, I found that I was moving away from the whole dichotomy of optimism, pessimism. People would often ask me, and I would often ask them, whether they felt optimistic or pessimistic about the situation. And of course, generally speaking, I felt pessimistic because of my experience of obvious things not happening in the way that they seemingly should do. The evidence seemed to point not towards optimism, but hope, on the other hand, is a much more powerful and engaging way of seeing or engaging with the situation, that there is always hope. There are always things, all these examples which Andrew and Nicky and also Gwyn and others can point out, they demonstrate that things are possible. It's possible to see things differently, to imagine things differently, and to understand and work together differently and create change differently to the way that we have. And therefore that gives hope. So I'm just interested in this distinction. I now give up on optimism and pessimism, and I just see hope versus despair. But it's still possible to be poised and balanced and to feel that you could tilt either way on that spectrum. It's not like that's gives you an automatic way to move forwards. It actually makes it more perilous, in a sense, if you see the dilemma as being one between a continual one between hope and despair. So I'm very interested in the words that you said, but I'd be interested in just drawing out this distinction between hope and optimism, because you can still see things going badly and worse and still nevertheless be engaged towards in a hopeful direction.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with you. I'm teetering.
Roger.
Yeah, hi Andrew. Nice to see you again. Hi Nicky. Nice to put a face to a name. Roger Higwin. I run the network of wellbeing down in Totnes. I'm actually in my kitchen, which is why I turned the thing off, because you probably don't want me to watch me putting on boiled potatoes in the oven or anything like that. I just really wanted to get a feel for, you've done a number of these stories, and I'm wondering how the politicians are responding. I'm wondering how those, the hard-bitten, cynical journalists are responding. And maybe if you could say something about, if has that taught you anything, or do you think there are any lessons there about how our leaders actually think about things that we need to take on board?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I'll also kind of round off with just one comment on the previous thing about drawing a distinction between hope and optimism. I really like how Rebecca Solnit writes about hope being something which can be used in emergencies, and it's something that is fundamentally empowering, I think, for me personally, and I want to be able to live in a state of hope, because it makes me I think it makes me more effective in the things that I do. The optimism thing, I think, is slightly, I find that a little bit more smoke-like and harder to actually pin down, because as I try to kind of observe my own states of mind as I engage in this work, the optimism seems to spring quite irrationally sometimes. I don't know. I'm not exactly sure where it comes from. There seems to be some sort of background set level of optimism, which I haven't yet sort of dipped below, and I can't really explain it. And I understand that it's not actually perfectly rational, because when I apply in a kind of an intellectual analysis to the situation, I can see where the lines are going, and you know, on the graphs, etc. But so hope is the condition I suppose I kind of choose to live in. Optimism is something which I appear to just have, and this is the thing which, you know, some of my friends can find quite annoying, because I appear to be, you know, irrationally optimistic sometimes. That's that. On the issue of kind of where things have got, one of the objectives we set ourselves actually when we created the Alliance was to try and move the space, try to kind of open up the space around the possibilities for rapid change, and in doing so, hopefully raise ambitions for what could be achieved in policy terms. And one of the things I think I've very much noticed is we want to, and you know, how do you, whenever you run a project, people say, how are you going to measure it? So we've tried to kind of keep a track of the occurrence and the use of the kind of the phraseology around rapid transition, and we've charted a dramatic rise in the use of that as a framing in climate policy terms, in domestically and internationally, in UN circles, etc. And I think we were helped enormously by the fact that we also happened to launch publicly just at the time that the IPCC published its 1.5 degrees report, which upped the ante on the need for change. And so I think that's been, I think it's one of those things which has sort of seeped into the conversation and has become sort of understood. But at the same time, going back on the thing that I said earlier, whilst that this sort of acknowledgement has sort of seeped in beneath our feet of what's actually needed, the twistiness of the political system, because it never escapes its fundamentally vested interests, and its ability to perform sort of rhetorical and policy gymnastics in order to keep doing what it's always done, it is quite fascinating. So an example of that might be how we had a retread of the debate about the importance of shifting off dependence on imported oil and gas as a consequence of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And of course, the current Conservative government have flipped that and twisted it into an argument such that, domestic energy security now means more tenaciously dragging every last ounce of oil and gas out from under the North Sea. So nothing is ever you've got to kind of fight all the way on these things. And I think it's the old lesson about what the price of saving the NHS is constant vigilance. And I think constant vigilance in terms of the nature of the climate debate, so that things don't get co-opted and twisted in this way, is also the case. So I think, as ever, you sort of make progress in one direction, but then someone tries to kind of flip it in another. So that would be my thought on
Andrew,
that.
One thing to mention with I noticed it particularly with the BBC, but maybe it's just a coincidence, but I noticed a hell of a lot of our stories ending up in BBC stories. So you find something that's been on the website, and obviously we're trying to promote them all the time. And Andrew does a lot of the direct press with media, and I don't think people are rushing out to write a story about every single thing we put out. But it is interesting to see that they come back through the sort of metaverse. I suddenly see someone will send me something, go, oh, look at this, and I think, oh yeah, it looks just like the story we wrote last year. And I don't think that's a coincidence in this day of recycling information. And sometimes you can see exactly where stuff has come from. That's great. That's what we want. We want to see it popping up and being used as examples of what's possible all the time.
Jane.
Yeah, again, thank you. My name is Jane Shaw. I work in environmental communication and about how we make those visions for the future more positive. And I think, again, it's this idea of hope versus optimism. And Ellen Kelsey, she in Hope Matters wrote about, she almost defines them as different. She talks of hope as being evidence-based, and she talks about optimism as wishful thinking. And when I kind of first read that, I was quite uncomfortable with it. It didn't quite sit right. But then she starts talking about the fact that as soon as she starts talking about hope, people come at her with their worst story possible, you know, and it's almost like they're treating her like she's being naive and ill-informed, and they want her to realize the bad reality of climate by telling them the worst example they can think of. And I think actually when she starts talking like that, it begins to make more sense to redefine them as those two different things, because hope is not complacency in a way that optimism might be. And I think that really began to resonate with me. And it is that thing you almost can't be optimistic based on evidence, which you can, but you can't. Whereas hope is absolutely, I'm hopeful because, you know. And yeah, I just found that quite an interesting distinction, the way she does it. It doesn't sit comfortably even now, but it is a very interesting distinction for me.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Hope is not complacent. It fits well with your thing, Andrew, about vigilance, you know, constant vigilance. True.
Jan, Helen, any thoughts?
It's been interesting. I think what I'm interested in is the direction the conversation's taking into, you know, discussion about hope and optimism, and I'm not feeling particularly connected with that, if I'm honest. But what I am connecting with is what you were saying at first about telling stories, about practical stories about how things have worked, how we have adapted, and how we, you know, human beings, we're here and we are, as, dare I say it, successful as a species. We could argue that, but let's just say in terms of presence and numbers. But it's because we have this ability to change and transform and adapt and respond and move and pivot. And it's kind of there waiting to be channeled. So I'm really interested in where you've landed with stories and telling specific stories. And that fits with my interest. I've been doing quite a bit of writing lately about just this you know, I live in Dartmoor. And sometimes it can be very hard to get, sometimes it's just so lovely, you know, it's just so lovely, and it can be quite hard to connect with the fact that we're going to hell in a handcart, if I and so I've been playing with this place, and it's kind of immediate and it's personal, ordinary and domestic. So I'm wanting to get away from heroic stories or abstract stories. I want to get away from being abstract, which might be why I wasn't connecting so much with the discussion about hope and optimism. You know, I just kind of want to know what here in this place, what do I see that I love, that I care about, that gives me hope, or that makes me feel hopeless? What do I do with those feelings when they come up? Where do I take that, and how does that speak to the wider, you know, beyond me, you know? So how does that fit beyond just me and my story and individualism and narcissism and all of that? How can that be a way of helping people to connect and relate to their circumstances? And so I love what you're doing with stories, and my stories are different insofar as they're ordinary, domestic, local, not just local in Devon, but local wherever I happen to be. What do I notice wherever I happen to be? And some of that is the tensions and the difficulties and the way that we are all imperfect. We are all, by nature of being, well, in this room anyway, Western, white, privileged. We're all implicated. I took a flight last month, and I really agonized over it, and I browbeat, and I kind of went, oh my goodness, but I did it. But what does that mean? I could pretend I didn't, I could pretend I'm perfect, but actually I went to the airport and I got on that plane with my family and we went to the sunshine. And I realized that I didn't want to give that up. But what does that say about me as somebody who knows about this stuff and cares about this stuff, the fact that I do that? So I think there's those kind of stories about not being perfect and getting it wrong and what does it mean? And I don't want permission or an excuse or anything, but how do we engage with that? So anyway, that was what was going on in my head, which was kind of connected, but yeah, kind of connected, but in a different way.
I just wanted to kind of jump in really quickly on that, because I think it's a really fundamental and important point about the way in which starting from the basis, as you say, none of us are perfect. Mm-hmm. And yet there is a way in which the right weaponizes imperfection to suggest that unless you are perfect and you lead a fully coherent life, you've got no right to stand up and speak about these issues. One of the areas in which we've been having this conversation a lot is we're working with a lot of people in sport at the moment, partly because they've got such a massive audience, partly because it's such a huge bit of kind of cultural activity and everybody does it and people can relate to it, etc., etc., etc. Partly because sport is extremely exposed to climate issues and it also has a big carbon footprint. And one of the conversations that we're having a lot, especially with kind of elite athletes and sports people who have to travel a lot, is they feel really under pressure that they want to speak out, but they don't want to speak out because if they speak out, they'll have their imperfections and their, any internal contradictions in their life pointed out. And I think one of our tasks as campaigners is to try and neutralize the way in which a space has been created in the public domain where you can't speak unless you're perfect, and to make people feel that it's okay. And I think having more conversations like what you've just been saying in public to say, that we're wrestling with these things and we know we're not right. We might be doing X, Y, and Z, but we haven't sorted out A, B, and C yet. And I think it really helps to hear people say those things publicly, because it validates the struggles that other people might have, but it might also help us come up with ways in which we can deal with it and sort of and get better in the process.
That was really, I feel that would be a really useful topic for a future discussion, because it is shameful and we're all implicated. So that was really helpful. How do we have those conversations? And it is weaponized. And I do loads of good, I do good stuff. I've got a B corporation that I founded. I'm kind of, I do loads of good stuff, but I did get on a plane. Sometimes I don't get on a plane. So now when I go to Inverness, I'll take the train and I'll take the train back. But when you're going to the Canaries, there's not a lot of choice. And when I go to Florence, I'll be coming back on the train, but I have to fly out on the plane. This is for a meeting, later, because I'm working before. I can't do it. It's kind of,
on a small practical level, even just sort of saying those things out loud, I think gives other people. I mean, like I've had this conversation in my running club. The first time I raised the idea that as a club we might have a default position where we would first and foremost go to races, even if they were kind of like in Europe, that we could kind of get to easily by train, because there's no shortage of races that you can run in. And there were people would just, the question wasn't even being asked around flying. And the first time I raised it, people were that's not fair. Some people felt, I think, threatened and slightly horrified at the thought they should even have to think about this. But now, less than a year on from raising that comment, it's a common topic of conversation, and people are proactively talking about races that they can get in Europe that they can get the train to, and having that conversation, I think, has really helped, because suddenly people, just by having it, you realize, actually there are other ways of getting around, and maybe I can do this bit like that bit like that, and we make progress by having those conversations.
Yeah, I think it's kind of, I think it's easy to get absolutist, and then that just shuts down any space for speaking.
Mark's first. Jan, did you want to comment? Or
Sure. I was really excited when I saw the title of this. I'm Jan. I live in the Midlands, and my work is as a nature connection guide, and I run an online course helping people to connect with their local nature. And I've been on a kind of a seesaw this last few years, from despair to hope, horror to hope. And I think I've kind of come to a place of hope through horror at the moment. And what really helps me is positive stories. And it's, for me, it's more the oblique ones where people make a change that doesn't have a direct end point. They just say, this is the right direction to go. So like the guy who did the TED talk, who worked in a big finance company, and he was asked what he wanted for his bonus. And he said, I'd like to start all our meetings with a 1-minute silence. And so they did that. And though they thought he was crazy, and then that became a 3-minute silence, and then a 10-minute silence. And suddenly the company was making very different decisions, and people were, it just transformed the way they operated. Now, that was just an act of faith. And so when I come to question what I'm doing, and I'm like, I should just go and work in an eco-restoration camp, what am I doing? I just think, well, I do not know where all of those changes of heart and heart's opening, where it goes, because things ripple out. And that's what gives me hope, is to see where one seemingly little decision has lots of positive benefits, and then they knock into other ripples coming from in other directions. And I think it's wonderful what you're doing. I think the media is more dangerous than politics, and I really am excited to hear that your stories are rippling out in the media, because I think that's where things can change. Because I don't believe in politics changing anything anymore. It's got to be grassroots. It's got to be us. That's my personal belief, and I think the media has such power to take us all along and nurture that hope, so that we can all act. Thank you.
Thanks, that was great. I see that Jane said, do you have a link to the story? Because I think we're all thinking, oh, that's a great story. We want to write that one up straight away. So yes, I agree completely. I love those small examples. And I think Helen said earlier, it's not, although some of our examples on the website are huge, and some are really, really small. And I don't really see any massive difference between them. I think you can't really tell what's going to have the big impact at the end. So sometimes a lot of our stuff is focused on very local examples, and also they're much easier to convey to people. And on many levels, they're more interesting too. It's like reading a story once upon a time. You want a person, you want a human, or somebody to whom something amazing happened, or somebody who did something amazing, and your story's off and off you go. If you start from the point of view of some kind of systemic change, it's really hard to make that into a story. So I think the specific is what stories are about. That's the beauty of them. And then as humans, I think we naturally understand that. We clock it. We can see the opportunities in it straight away. It sort of doesn't matter where it comes from, really, what culture or wherever. I think we're quite good at, we're acquisitive magpies, aren't we? We take good stuff, ideas we want from all over the place. We nick whatever we can get our hands on, and use it in what we're doing. And I think, so in some ways, I feel like you, Jan. I think with politics, I still sort of stumble along in this world, but I feel increasingly motivated by what I see happening around me, by all sorts of amazing people like yourselves and other grassroots organizations just doing stuff. And compared to what's happening in the so-called formal political structures, it's very disappointing and sad, actually. On some level, it's just sad. It's a poor reflection of what, as humans, we're able to do. We're able to do better than that, as Andrew said. We can do a lot better.
I'd like to pick up on something that Jan said, because that really resonated for me. This, when she was talking about the seesaw of the conversation between optimism and pessimism. And over Christmas, I realized that I can't live with that question any longer, because it gets me on that seesaw, and I hate the seesaw. So just being addressed with that question disempowers me. And it took me a while to realize it. And it's because it drags me into a space of fear, because the pessimism dominates the optimism. And as you said, you sort of feel guilty for feeling optimistic, but that means the only refuge is to be pessimistic. And so I just realized I just don't want to play that game anymore. I don't want to answer these black and white questions that, you know, the press simplify everything down to. And what Helen was saying about almost the feeling the guilt of taking a flight. Well, the thing that gave me refuge there was when someone gave me this lovely phrase that sustainability is the outcome of conscious thinking. So anything that allows us to be more conscious is the starting point of moving towards a sustainable outcome. So sustainability is the outcome of a conscious process. So Helen's sort of agony about taking the flight to me says, but she's conscious. She's aware of the negative impacts and is doing it because the positives outweigh it. So, you know, for me, taking family abroad means we're showing them what a beautiful place the world is. That consciousness can plant seeds that could have massive positive impacts in the future. So that's what gives me, if you like, permission to drive to a conference on sustainability or whatever. It's just that the intent's there. But what really resonated for me this year, I started working with the Jurassic Coast Trust, which for those on the South Coast will know it. It's the organization that got the UNESCO responsibility for the Jurassic Coast. And they've taken this very strange decision that, as well as that, they're going to invite businesses on that strip of land to become members of the trust. So they've got this business group that is tied up with the UNESCO's responsibilities. And of course it is, because their businesses are totally dependent on the beauty of that land, despite the fact it's being sort of, you know, crumbling into the sea. But also, you know, they're all in the tourist trade, because it's a beautiful piece of ground and people come to it as tourists, but they can't let them trash the area. So they've got to get this balance. And they asked me to address their conference last month. And I took it on the basis of saying, well, let's just look at doing good and doing well. So instead of choosing between the two, which is quite often the dichotomy people face, oh, you've got to choose between having your company doing well or you doing good as a person. And I said, well, no, do both. Ignore that divisive question and just do both. And actually, it was almost unnecessary, because there were 4 companies and organizations that spoke after me. They weren't worried about this. They were just doing as individual people who'd set up organizations the way they wanted to. They were just doing good no matter what. And the 3 examples of businesses, I have never seen such superb examples of sustainable businesses. And I never put those 2 words together. But these companies were. There was nothing I could think of that they hadn't done in order to help to make their company sustainable. In every dimension, they put the work in to do the research. They saw that as part of the governance and responsibility of running a small business. And some of them were just going outside and looking at how the land they were on was today and looking at how they could improve it as part of their business. And it was so holistic. And these weren't people that were looking at the science. These were just human beings looking at their place in nature and making sure that their company was reflecting how they felt. And of course, they're SMEs, but it emboldened me to say, well, actually, when we work in the positive space where you're inspired to act and you just do what your heart tells you, quite often that's enough. And where it's not, okay, you just learn from that. So it's not being perfect, as I think Andrew was saying. It's almost saying, don't let perfection get in the way of doing good. They were just running their businesses on what was good for them as human beings. And I think actually I'm in the place now where I trust that behavior is actually enough, because I think one day the politicians and the people who hold the financial power will just wake up and realize we've moved on. We're doing something else. We're doing this, and it's a ground up process of people just doing what they think's the right thing to do and ignoring the rules. So that's what gives me the trust that I'm feeling today, and empowering me to actually do things rather than fall into that fear of the optimist versus pessimist seesaw that Jan mentioned. Roger.
Yeah, it's another question, really. Quite a lot of the examples you've spoken about happened in the past. And I've seen some of the things that have been talked about the pandemic. And I just wonder whether you had any examples that you could sort of identify today that you think might happen in the near future, of some rapid transitions. And one of the reasons I'm asking that is I'm a great believer in sort of second and third mover advantages. And if there are local projects you think that are so brilliant that somebody else should be doing them somewhere else to see how, as part of creating the movement, I'd love to know.
I'm really tempted to say that almost by definition, anything that's happened has happened in the past.
Absolutely.
But actually, I mean, so several things. Possibly the largest amount of storytelling and kind of content that we've put onto the site in the last 2 or 3 years has been related to the extremely diverse experiences during the pandemic. That's related to everything from industrial conversion, in which manufacturers have overnight repurposed production lines to the public purpose, or in ways which might have related to the pandemic. So, for example, you had makers of cosmetics and brewers who started making sanitizing gel. You had fast fashion companies and some other companies who started making personal and protective equipment. You had Formula One motor engineers whose designers were tasked with aiding low-cost breathing devices, less invasive breathing devices for hospitals. So you have something like that. You have something, I mean, something in which we could go sort of further, I think, in terms of appreciating and understanding the sort of the centrality of two things which are sort of second nature to greens, I suppose. One is the classic sort of repair, reduce, reuse, recycle economy, the localization of stuff, and the reskilling, something which is a kind of one of the profound narratives of the transition movement. I think we saw through that countless examples of people reskilling in terms of doing things which would be far more common and prominent and central and core in a green economy, whether that's growing your own food or making stuff last longer, or transferring of skills, or making better use of local green space, making our own entertainment. All these kind of things, I think, flourished in different ways in circumstances which drove it. But then when experienced, there was a lot of evidence that we were able to gather that demonstrated all the, how it ticks all the kind of many of the kind of 5 ways to well-being boxes, etc., and is very much to do with reweaving economic connections, which provides you a more solid foundation from which you can kind of make those kind of those sort of economic transitions. Notwithstanding either, of course, the way in which the furlough program and people having time on their hands gave them the time to do those things. So when I think of 2 of the great interventions which I think create the social and economic space for people to be able to be part of the transition, I think the experimentation with the shorter working week on the one hand, and the demonstration by government that it can very clearly in circumstances become the wage payer of last resort, as it did with the furlough scheme, demonstrate the kind of much greater breadth of policy flexibility in order to kind of create the space for change to happen. So I think these are things which are, very recent lived. And actually, one of my profound concerns at the moment is that we will move on so quickly that we'll forget some of the revealed potential and agency that we demonstrated over the last 3 or 4 years. And of course, I mean, other things, hugely sort of moving things, like the emergence of the mutual aid networks, many of which are still sort of active, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think I think there's quite a lot around, actually. And you'll find on our website that because of the way that we tag our stories, you can very neatly go through the decades and see which ones happened when. I think there's quite a lot from the last decade, and there's a huge amount from the last 2 decades. So a lot of them are pretty current and ongoing, I think.
One thing I'd like to add is community energy. I think it's one of those areas where people are well ahead of the government and are kind of going, come on, you know. Around where we are, I don't know if it's the same with you. There's a lot of spaces where you have areas that have been made conservation areas, towns and villages, in a bit of a blanket way, and then the regulations then apply to that area, which is basically just a sort of hodgepodge traditional market town, and suddenly none of those buildings can have solar panels on them. That's how the rules are being interpreted, which is absolutely bonkers, you know, for something that is that's temporary anyway and could be removed in the future. So a lot of people I think there's very creative and interesting and powerful things being done with energy, that people are just doing it themselves, and I think it's great when it's community energy, particularly better than people being incentivized just to do things on their own houses. I mean, it's good if that's the only option you have, but I think the idea of getting together is really important, and there's plenty of examples of that on the website and out there. I think that's only going to grow.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess it's interesting what you were saying, Andrew, because you know what happened 3 years ago in some sense is history, and people do move on. And I'm not saying we should forget those lessons. I think it's important you remember them, and people remember them. I guess I was interested very much in that energy side and thinking, well, you know, what's happening now that is an opportunity that we, you know, and we've explored them. And if you've got examples of particular energy initiatives. Because people where I am are looking at solar, they are looking at wind suddenly. But if there's other things you think, you know, I'm particularly always interested in anything that might involve community retrofit of houses. If you come across a great project on that, I'd love to replicate that. You know, so I'm just wondering about that. But anyway, sorry, I should shut up because other people want to talk.
I think we're probably going to have to wind up soon, aren't we, Gwyn? I don't know if you want to finish up, because I know Andrew's got to leave.
Well, certainly Andrew has to leave. So first of all, thank you very much, Andrew and Nicky. I think it's lovely to see how another organisation's working, and the process that you got to where you are today. It's a very different insight. So thank you very much. I think it's been very provocative. So Andrew, feel free to leave. For those of you who want to stay for another couple of minutes, I've just got one question I'd like to put to the ASP people here. Is that you know, this may not be your first look at RTA. You may have come across it before, but I just wonder what you think are the ways in which we could sort of collaborate or coordinate or work together with RTA, which is a very different sort of organisation and than ASP. Any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure if it even has to be formal, Gwyn. I mean, for me, I'd not come across RTA before today. And when you kind of said at the beginning about, you almost said that, oh, we don't do, we just think, and you almost framed it as a negative. And I was like, do you know what? There's a space for it. And I find ASP one of the most valuable. In fact, I described it this week to someone who's getting into sustainability, and I said, look, if you want to make money from your network, join Women in Sustainability. If you want to be inspired and grow your understanding, join ASP. And that's, you know, there's a place for both for me. You know, they're both incredibly valuable. And I think simply having that awareness and being able to go, as an individual, I can tap in that way. You know, it's for me, it is just that awareness. And having it brought to my attention has been really useful, really helpful. I'm really looking forward to understanding more about it. But that's going to be very different than anyone else can bring to it. You know, that it's going to bring to somebody else. That's my 2 pence.
Thank you. Yeah.
Does the Rapid Transition Alliance have a LinkedIn page?
I don't think we do, because we're not a constituted organisation. We're sort of a campaign, really, so we don't exist as a thing. And so Andrew and I have our own personal LinkedIn pages, and we tend to post through that. So that will be the way to find us, or to find that information. I try to post stories that I think are useful on LinkedIn.
Yeah. So, because I'm just thinking that is a way that we can just help get the stories out there, because LinkedIn is quite a good platform.
Well, thank you. I mean, do feel free to, you know, poke me, and I probably don't do it well enough, but you know, do poke me on LinkedIn, and I will remember to put things on there and share things more often, because I agree with you. It is good. It's a much less sort of frenetic place to put things on than the running world of Twitter. Andrew does Twitter very, very well, but
I can't get on with Twitter, unfortunately.
So, response to Helen and Jane's comments there, one idea we could simply do is just to reconstitute the Alliance page, which you may not have noticed. We had an Alliance page up there where we just feature the Alliance organisation. So look, it exists, and this is some example of its work. And that could be something that Nicky then says maybe once a month or something. Hey, there's we've done some new work. Can we just post it on that page, so that we act as like a promotion for it. So this has been useful for the people that turned up to link into it. But in 6 months' time, you know, other people will come along and may not know. But I mean, that's the easiest thing we can do. And occasionally just feature a relevant story, like we've done with some of Mark's work recently, on the newsletter, to just bring people's attention to it. I mean, that might be all we need to do.
That might be all. And I think it might also be nice to check in half a year or a year and just do this again and just see what's new since when. You know, what are the trends, and what have we seen, and what are the stories that we want to be shouting about and telling and sharing. Actually, what are the stories you want to be sharing? So I would be happy to show up. I don't know what good time distance would be, but to kind of make it a slot, if you like.
Thank you. Good idea. Any other questions or thoughts or comments on any topic? In which case, I shall let Jan go for it. Yes.
Just a quick question for Nicky is, do you welcome people sending you their stories, stories of hope? Do you actively correct them?
Yeah, we do. I mean, we have we've built as an alliance of organisations. So we normally, people sign up a pledge on the website, which is quite straightforward and simple pledge to be working towards a sustainable future. And then one of the things in that form is to say, do you have any ideas or stories? So that's how we collect information, how one of the ways in which we collect stories that speak to people. But to be honest, if you just contact me individually and say, have you seen this, or this is a good thing happening, have you seen it? You know, the main test for us is it something that's scalable and replicable? Is the meat of it, the intention and the drive and of it replicable and scalable. And if it is, then it's something that we run a constant list of what our next stories are going to be. And yes, please, it's always good to have input from the real world. That's what we do. Thank you.
Whoops, wrong one. Right. Okay. Well, thank you all for turning up today, this afternoon, Jane, for you, or morning maybe. It's been lovely. And Roger, good to see you. I think it's the first time I've come across you. And I just want a brief update on something. We're having our next face-to-face meeting at ISP down at Schumacher again on May 31st. Jagdish Ratanani is working with Satish to cover or to introduce Satish's new book, which is all about Jagdish's new book, which is all about Satish Kumar, Abundance Love. It's been published next month, and we're featuring that at the Great Hall on the May 31st at 8 o'clock in the evening. And we're looking at having, everyone's invited. It's completely free. So I know some of you live around there. Roger, it couldn't be much closer, could it? So hopefully we'll see you there. We're looking at getting some other things organised around it, but the bare minimum, we're probably going to the White Hart on site for dinner, meeting up there. We could have a formal session, but just a social, and then we'll meet with Satish in the evening. We might do things in the afternoon, like just go for a walk in the grounds or book a room. We're getting some ideas together, and we'll send that out via the newsletter and via other means over the next month or so. So hopefully to meet up there. So in the meantime, thank you very much. I hope you had a great Easter, and look forward to seeing you in some other events we're holding later this month, particularly Jane's on inspiring stories on degrowth, which is it's got quite a few people already registered, Jane, so it's obviously showing interest. So look forward to seeing some of you, if not all of you, then. Thanks a lot, Nicky, for organising this and bringing Andrew along. It's been really insightful. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Lovely to see you all. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.